pleased to be here. I hope you're not all feeling too depressed or scared, because listening to all of that, I got a little bit worried, and I was thinking, why would anyone want to be using these platforms as consumers or sellers or businesses if there's all these kind of problems? And happily, I think things are rather more positive than some of the problems which have been aired, which is obviously to create a discussion, but I think we can focus on quite a lot of the more positive things, which may well be the reasons that many of you in the room already use these platforms, because you find a tremendous number of benefits. So let's focus a little bit more on that. And I'm going to do that in a sort of historical way. I'm going to talk about the past, the present, and the future to try and come to where we are now and where we're going. So the first thing to point out is, of course, that I think as Martin's European Commission Legoland picture showed, is that platforms have always been a thing. Platforms are by no means a new economic phenomenon. They are by no means a new social phenomenon. As we went out for drinks in warm Bratislava last night and walked through a number of market squares, we can well imagine the markets which have taken place there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They are the classic market square where buyers and sellers meet. Now, obviously, 500 years ago in Bratislava, there was no online dimension of the platform. They were just platforms. But the platform phenomenon is something that we know and understand well. There are much more recent things than medieval marketplaces. So let's think about newspapers, for example. I was reading Wikipedia this morning to find out what were the main Slovakian newspapers, and it told me that one of the most prominent political dailies is called SME. And I went to SME's online edition, and it confirmed what I probably already knew, which is that it is an online platform, a place where advertisers and eyeballs meet. And of course, it was suggested a minute ago that data is a new phenomenon, and something particularly related to platforms, and particularly related to online platforms. That's not true either. Newspapers have always been data businesses. People will know the story of Reader's Digest in the United States, which was a magazine which was primarily about collecting data. There was no online dimension of that. So data is not a new phenomenon. It takes on important new dimensions in the online world, but that is not a new phenomenon. Stock exchanges, of course, are very well understood and very well known places where there is exchange between buyers and sellers of company shares. That is a pre-internet phenomenon. It is also a phenomenon which has now moved on to the internet. So we go from offline platforms to online platforms like stock exchanges. So many of these phenomena, particularly to economists, are not new. They take different shapes, but they're not new. Now to come to a much more recent past, last week I attended a dinner in Brussels in the very impressive brand showroom of BMW, the car company, where they display some of their latest models, and they have wonderful videos of where things are going. And the gentleman in charge of BMW in the Benelux showed us a video about BMW's connected car ambitions. And of course, while showing how these cars potentially might become autonomous as they would take control of more and more things, he also showed us what the user or driver of the car would be able to do, the services they would be able to access while they were driving. And there were icons up there such as Twitter or search engines or Spotify, all kinds of different icons, which illustrate beautifully that BMW, just as me, sees that the connected car is an online platform. 20 years ago, cars were metal and leather. They certainly weren't digital, and they certainly weren't platforms. You bought a car from BMW, and that was it. Now they're both digital, and they're platforms. There's interactions between the car sits between the user and all the other services. And this takes us beautifully to the present where I am standing now physically, and the present time. Gunther just mentioned, I thought it was that Slovakia was the world's largest producer of cars per capita, or second. Let's go with largest anyway. So clearly this is a strategic industry in terms of Slovakia's economic present and hopefully Slovakia's economic future. It's going to be absolutely indispensable, I would argue, that the policy position taken by the Slovakian government and the European Union is one which attracts investors rather than pushing them away. One of the most important things to the investment community is positive noises, positive signals that what the authorities want to do is to attract certain types of investments rather than seeing them as problems. So I would argue that one of the most significant things the Slovakian authorities need to do is to say, we need to be, both in terms of talent and in terms of attitude, the place where the car platform of tomorrow is invented, rather than suggesting and sending signals that we don't want to be the place, that we are nervous about this phenomenon. Also in the present, let me give some other examples about how platforms both benefit buyers and sellers, and probably more importantly for this political discussion, how they make the digital single market, which is the ambition that the European Commission has set out. And indeed, what platforms do is to make markets. So let's take some examples. If you've ever heard of or used the French car-sharing platform BlaBlaCar, you'll know that BlaBlaCar has achieved ambitions, social and economic and environmental, which policymakers have been trying to achieve for decades, to get people to carpool more. And the platform that BlaBlaCar has created has made this a reality, where previously it was very partial. It also promotes cross-border transport in a way which is otherwise complex. Let's consider commerce. On eBay, 93% of sellers selling on eBay platforms sell across border. 93%. Of those, 39% sell to 4 or more countries. eBay makes the market. It makes the single market, and it makes the market between buyers and sellers. On Amazon in 2014, Amazon sellers, so not Amazon selling its own stuff, but the companies that use the Amazon platform to sell, earned 2.8 billion in revenues of cross-border sales in Europe alone. 2.8 billion worth of revenues, which would have been practically impossible for them before a platform such as Amazon would have existed, when cross-border commerce was considerably more expensive and much more difficult to advertise yourself across border. Cloud services, there are many famous cloud service providers, allow small businesses to scale up extremely quickly. Whether you're a government service or whether you're a private sector service, once upon a time, if you didn't know when you launched whether you would have 100 users, 1,000 users, 1 million users, or 10 million users, you had to go along to the computer shop and buy a lot of servers, a lot of big boxes, without knowing how many customers you were going to get. That was very expensive, and you'd probably get it wrong because you didn't know how rapidly your service would develop. These days, you don't need to do that. Cloud platforms will let you increase the amount of server space you're using depending on how successful you are and how many users you have. That is an enormous benefit and allows cross-border commerce. On to the regulatory present. So as Martin talked about, the Commission presented its position, its communication on platforms 2 weeks ago now. It's a good communication. The Commission has listened very carefully to what are the real challenges. It has understood that there are huge differences between connected cars or e-commerce sites or social networks or stock exchanges. They're so different that there's no point trying to come up with a common law for all of them. The laws against money laundering are necessarily different from the laws for vehicle security, and they must be treated separately. That's a very good thing. Whether this will lead, and the actions it announces, to a brighter future, well, we'll need to wait a couple of years before we know that. One of the things which has been telegraphed in that, and some of the speakers have already mentioned this morning, is transparency. Transparency is a very good thing. Let me just make a point, I think, about, and I would be interested to know if people agree with me. All of you probably have used many of the major services who are members of the CCIA, and I suspect there are millions, if not billions, of people around the world who know how these services work and who know how to recognize what is an advertisement versus what is not an advertisement. There are thousands of journalists who look at these services. There are thousands of regulatory authorities and judges who look at these services. They are well understood. Where there is a problem in terms of transparency tends to be in the less well-known services that do not attract billions of users, thousands of lawyers looking at their terms and conditions, and do not have the same level of scrutiny. And that's going to be where the interesting action is, to make sure there are no unscrupulous deals which are misleading to consumers about the services which are being offered. Secondly, on the present, the good news is that investment is booming in Europe. Last summer, we asked the investment community to try and model the amount of money that was going into online e-commerce in Europe, and they showed that between 2012 and 2015, investment boomed from 1 billion to 12 billion euros in the publicly available data. So can people compete? Can people enter into the market? Absolutely they can. Otherwise, these investors are completely stark, raving crazy and putting 12 billion at stake for no reason. We have some very good examples of how companies come into very tough markets. Let's take the e-commerce player Zalando, born in 2008, 2009 in Germany, in markets which are extremely tough. Focusing on fashion e-commerce, you've got to compete against H&M and Zara offline, and companies like Amazon online. And yet Zalando, which listed 2 years ago, has a valuation now of some 8 or 9 billion and is the most popular fashion e-commerce business in Europe with some 18 million users. So market entry is possible and it's happening. But where are we going next? Where's the future? The future is there's going to be more platforms, not fewer. The future is there's going to be more digitization. It's going to happen in more industries. We already talked about cars and the rapid progress. I read that yesterday in Berlin at a conference, the chairman of Daimler-Benz and the chief executive of Uber drove onto stage together at this conference to illustrate the interdependence between a well-established and historic car company like Daimler and a new and disruptive player. The chairman of Daimler predicted that with the help of the regulatory authorities and not the obstruction, there would be self-driving cars in 5 to 7 years. Given he's the chairman of Daimler-Benz, I'm going to take his prediction extremely seriously, and also his encouragement to the regulatory authorities to do their job and to do their work properly. Let me leave you with a final thought, which brings us all the way from the very distant past to where we're going in the future, and let you make a choice. A very interesting book looking at American economic growth since the middle of the 19th century was published last year by Robert J. Gordon. One of the statistics which emerges from that book and related research is that between the year 0, the year of the birth of Jesus Christ, and the year 1820, average economic growth around the world, I would normally ask, there are too many of you here, but I would normally ask, what do you think it is? Average economic growth around the world was 0.06% a year, 6% per century, which makes what we have now, which we're sometimes disappointed by, we realize not bad. Most humans in most part of the world live very, very short, dark, painful lives. They lived on a wage of equivalent to $500 US per person, a modern equivalent, so sub-Saharan African living standards for most people on Earth for almost 2 millennia. What happened at the end in the Industrial Revolution and from the 1870s or so was a dramatic series of innovations in electrification, in communications such as railways and telegraph, which gave rise to the huge industrial revolutions and a much more rapid pace of growth and a much greater living standards, which give us everything we know in terms of modern healthcare, modern education systems, social security systems, and disposable income. The question for the future is not, do we have too much digital disruption? It's, do we have enough? Given that over the last 30 or 40 years, the pace of economic growth relative to the 100 years before has slowed quite considerably. It's still a lot better than before, but it's slowed quite considerably. The question I leave you with is, do you think we need more digital disruption, or do we need less? Thank you.